I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch and you're ready for our exciting afternoon. It is an honor and privilege to facilitate our research panel discussion for you today. We have 5 panelists, as you can see. We have Dr. Walters, who provided our keynote speaker presentation this morning. We then have Dr. Paul Bialik. Dr. Bialik is an associate professor of mathematics and is the chair of the Department of Mathematics at Trinity University in Deerfield, Illinois. We then have Ms. Jillian Mackey. Ms. Mackey is a math specialist at Clarendon Hills Middle School in Community Consolidated School District 181 in Hinsdale. We are very excited to have her from that perspective, where she also focuses on creating and modeling lessons in classrooms that promote high student engagement, deep mathematic connections, and the use of mathematics language. We have with us Mr. David Wartowski. Mr. Wartowski is the Director of Mathematics for District 219 at Niles North High School in Skokie, Illinois. He is committed to closing opportunity gaps for diverse student populations. His most recent classroom-based developments are around creating student-centered classrooms via student self-assessment and grading. Our final panelist today is Mr. Robert Wood, who is a mathematics coach at DePaul University STEM Center. He is serving in a 5-year project designed to prepare Chicago public school teachers to provide high-quality mathematics instruction aligned to the Common Core state standards. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The process for our research. The process for our research panel is that we will be sharing with you some research and have a prepared question that will follow that research. So I'll be sharing with you the research and then introducing the question I will begin with one of our panel members, and then from there we will allow the other panel members to speak if they have a response to that question. Our first research point. It is difficult for researchers to specify exactly how different types of teaching and teacher qualities affect student achievement, because this would require untangling the complicated relationships that exist between teacher characteristics, teaching practices, and student learning. Our first panel discussion will start with Ms. Jillian Mackey. What do you consider to be the 3 most essential teacher practices in the mathematics classroom, and why?
The first thing that I thought was important within the classroom was questioning, and I tend to ask probing questions that promote thinking about math. Students need to start thinking rather than memorizing the algorithms. Questions like why and how are frequently used in my math classroom. The second essential practice I would say that I'm currently using and trying to implement within my building is facilitating activities that are actually engaging. I've tried to limit classroom lectures and move them towards mini lessons and increase the time spent on activities that promote deeper understanding. So students in middle school, they don't want to sit there and listen to these lectures as entertaining as I can try to make them. So I've kind of moved towards mini lessons and definitely activities. The last one that I'm doing right now is flexible grouping using Pretest. Students are at different levels, and those levels should be known, and all students need to keep learning. So by implementing flexible groupings, it allows for differentiation based on individual student needs, their background knowledge, their interests, and pacing. So also meaningful group work allows for teachers to have math conversations with students. I can assess the students, and I can lead interventions, and there's definitely opportunities for enrichment for the high-achieving students. So questioning, facilitating activities that are engaging, and flexible groupings using Pretest are my 3 essential practices.
Thank you. Any other panelists like to offer any additional insight to that question?
So one of the things that just comes to my mind is, first of all, I agree with everything Jillian said, and I think that to a previous question around like Danielson, I think that in our district we had a lot of initial trepidation around this new framework and whatnot, and now that we're using it, I think we're by and large finding that it's a really good tool for reflection, and a lot of the things that Jillian just talked about really come through that framework, and so I think it's been a really helpful tool in that regard. You know, I would also just want to provide like a different lens. When I thought about this question, I thought almost about these teacher practices, not just practically how they happen in the classroom, but almost like philosophically, where do they come from? And my gut response to this was actually similar to something Paul was asking me a little while ago, is what do we look for when we hire a teacher? And at the core of it, I think, is this idea that we want someone who's reflective. And I think reflective has different elements to it, and I think it's important to like kind of delve into each of those. And if you are reflective, a lot of these great practices begin to happen if you have the right tools, like a Danielson, like a good coach, and all those things. And so the aspects to me of reflection are about, one, knowing yourself, and I mean that authentically. That we are all people who look in the mirror and truly know and carry out what we believe. When we talked about like teachers fading perhaps from what they were when they came into the profession, like that's horrible, right? We all come in for great intentions and they're very personal, and to always hang on to that. And I think if you do those things genuinely, you're likely to carry out all these practices. I think being reflective also is about having purpose, and it's somewhat related to the first one, but purpose also might be looking at the curriculum. Why do I teach this stuff? If I've got a kid asking me, why am I learning this? Like, that's a really good question. And damn it, the fact that this kid asked it means I haven't done my job well enough. So that's part of the reflection too. What's really the purpose here? And then finally, the reflection outwardly of students. Do I really know my students? Every once in a while, I still hear a teacher say something like, well, you know what, I just don't know if they value education. My heart drops. Well, what do they value? And start from there. And if we carry out and start with our students' own identities and their values, and marry it with ours, we become a true community. Where I think a lot of the things, the questioning, these pedagogical, the meaningful, engaging activities, all that stuff can happen from a place that's very authentic, I think.
To build off what Jillian said about asking questions, I really think that speaks toward thinking about the process of understanding and doing mathematics and connecting it to prior learning. Very often, teachers want to funnel students toward a specific algorithm, maybe that they know or that they want students to learn, without really understanding whether students know why things work. So this idea of asking these questions, you might call them focusing questions, the why questions, the how questions. Why do you think that makes sense? Really getting to see what students know. And to build on what David was saying, I think the most essential practice in mathematics is how to build on student understanding to advance build on student thinking to advance mathematical understanding. And this really is formative assessment. Do we know what our students are bringing to the table so that way we can advance them each individually? And Phil Darrow, one of the writers of the Common Core, he often asks, are your students ready for your instruction, and how do you know? If you haven't taken the time to find out what they already know, then how do you know that they don't already know what you're about to teach them? And how are you capitalizing on what they're bringing to the table? So this idea of giving an assessment before you ever teach anything, finding out what students know, looking for evidence of understanding, looking for misconceptions, looking for misunderstandings, informing your teacher knowledge, and then making an informed instructional decision. Too often we're beginning backwards. We're saying, okay, I'm going to start by telling you, what you need to know, versus saying, what are you bringing to the table? And I think that's really key. Lastly, the last essential practice is really the ability to orchestrate productive discourse. And we want students to be discussing, we want them to be talking, but to what end, right? We have to build in these high cognitive, rich tasks that students are engaging in if we want discourse to happen. We're not going to be having great conversations on a very naked math problem. We need these non-traditional problems where students really can't see what the solution path is right away. They need a chance to make sense of things on their own. They need a chance to talk with other people. And then the teacher can bring the whole class together in this orchestrated discussion where they can highlight the things that students are bringing to the table and clear up some of these misunderstandings.
Much of what I'd like to say has already been said by the other panelists. So I regret that I'm going last, because I would have looked a lot smarter if I'd gone first. But that's life. That's okay. The only things I'd want to add is knowing. A good teacher knows his students, because when you look in their eyes, you can see whether they understand something or not. You can just tell. And so knowing in that sense, but also after a while, you know who, frankly, the weaker students are. And when I'm wandering around the class, helping out students, I make sure I stop by that student's desk or make sure somebody helps out that student. So a good teacher knows his or her students. And I would agree with reflecting, because we don't really learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. You try something and it doesn't work. So you think, well, what else can I do? Or you try something and it does work. A good teacher does reflect.
I think the real reason you went last is because of how much of Robert's salad Paul ate last night. Robert shared his salad, and Paul took more than half, and it was a really awkward moment at dinner. We didn't know each other that well. That's why we went last. But seriously, it's a true story.
It is true.
It's after lunch. You got to keep the kids engaged. I resonate with all of what was said. I just want to add one short thing, which is I've been in classrooms where teachers are getting used to asking more why than how. And I've seen that become kind of mind-numbing. Oh, teacher's going to ask why over and over to the same two people, and I've seen the other 28 kids check out. So I think it's a good first step, but in classrooms where, and it builds off of these other points that you've made about knowing your students and being reflective and formative assessment, that involves knowing where all your kids are and making sure that even some of those good questioning strategies don't become like any other approach that kids tune out. That's my only other thought.
But I think there's an opportunity there for students to become the question askers. I think that the teacher is really modeling what it is to be curious to some degree and getting students to eventually to take over the asking, why did you do that?
Right.
And that really happens a lot in the small group interactions and can transfer to whole group discussions.
Yeah, and as long as it's most of the kids in the class that get to asking those questions, when you see that and compare it when it's like, oh, it's the same 2 or 3 kids, it's better than none, I think that's a real hard thing to do.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about continuous improvement. And going off where you were ending earlier this morning, is that even here we're seeing like we're building on each other, and it's never ending. We could handle this one question forever and ever and ever, and then try stuff out and reflect on that, And so I think that there's sort of two sides to this conversation in a way, that there's here's the things that we do know, and you should do these things. We know that reaching all kids has to happen, and they have to be engaged, and you should be asking, well, how did you get it? We know all these things. There's also the things that we don't know, and we don't know it for that particular kid in that particular setting with that particular teacher, and so there has to be the process side of things, that we must make sure that there is a process in place for every teacher, that they're part of a community, and they have the attitude to constantly be reflecting on how did that go. All the things that we know now, we've learned over time as a profession, that comes from falling down and picking ourselves up and trying a new thing. And so we're not at some promised land right now. There's more for us to learn, particularly in individual situations. And so it's a combination of doing what we know works and trying new things through a process that we can work within.
Point is engaging students in mathematical communication requires the teacher to take on a specific role to facilitate discussion and foster the development of students' communication skills. The question to that is, how do the speaking and listening expectations within the standards for mathematical practice impact the classroom, and how can we help teachers facilitate productive classroom discussions? We'll begin with David, please.
So ultimately, I think my answer to this was simple, although there's a very complex version of this. But when we look at the practices, there's 8 of them, right? And so to understand all of these, and I don't have them all memorized, and you got to read them and go, oh, that makes sense. So what we've done is to make it actionable. So in our department, we have really broken down to 2 things, and we focus there. And we consider these 2 things to be targets, learning targets that exist in every course. It could be Calculus BC, it could be our Algebra course. These 2 things a student must do. 1, they got to be able to communicate what they're thinking, communicate their critical thought, and critique the thinking of others. And then the second thing is this idea of persevering with problems they've never seen before. And that's it. So there are lots of other things we can talk about, and you get a list of 4 that I think are great. To me, to make it actionable, we have to kind of make it, in a way, simple. So by focusing on those two things in the classroom and just constantly coming back to that, assessing whether that's happening, talking to our students about it, giving feedback, whether they're there, having them self-assess, whether they think they're doing these things. Like, those are just true things that, in my mind, go beyond mathematics. I mean, I'm talking to the English head, humanities head, and telling him, yeah, we're working on ability to communicate their thinking and to stick with a problem. And he's like, well, that's what we're teaching. You know, and then I read studies, it turns out that if you can do these things, you know, you're going to get a better job, you're going to get paid more, you're more likely to have a happy marriage if you can communicate well what you're thinking and listen to others and persevere with solving problems. So these are like core human characteristics that mathematics happens to be all about, and it turns out to be empowering beyond mathematics, which I think is great. But it really so it's those two things that make it actionable, I think.
I think lesson structure plays a key role. You know, we have this idea from what we've learned about scaffolding, this I, we, you strategy, and in mathematics it doesn't really transfer well. So I'd love it if you could write this down. Instead of I, we, you, let's change it a little bit and let's restructure it. First, giving students a chance to try things on their own. So it begins with you. Then you all get to work together. So after you've had a chance to try working on a problem by yourself, you get to meet with the group and you get to discuss where you're at and, you know, learn from each other. So you all, and then we will discuss what came up. So this requires teachers to, you know, navigate the room, find out what students are bringing to the table to figure out, okay, what misconceptions do I want to highlight? What contributions from the students do I want to, you know, surface? So really thinking about this structure to promote discourse, you know, it's a flip from what we're normally used to. This I, we, you strategy doesn't really play too well in the mathematics classroom. Another thought is to really think of, you know, what is a lesson? A lesson is not what happens in one day. A lesson is the development of a concept or idea over time. Sometimes that takes a day and a half. Sometimes that takes 3 days. But really giving students a chance to learn and to discuss and talk. It's not going to you're not going to have rich discussions if you plow through the mathematics. So think of your lessons in this way. The first 2/3 where you and you all are working, that's divergent thinking. You know, students are trying to approach things from multiple perspectives. Then the last third where you're orchestrating this discussion is going to converge. You're bringing everyone together to move toward that grade level understanding that you want them to walk away with. And it's really the teacher's part to orchestrate the discussion. If you'd like to know further information, you can look up the 5 practices, Smith and Stein. That's what we're using in Chicago as one of the resources. Also, Thinking Through a Lesson Protocol is one of the articles that is related to that book. But, you know, moving away from this idea of show and tell, like, let's show what we did during this lesson, and let's really talk about it. As David said, you know, let's really critique each other's reasoning and justify why this makes sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That makes perfect sense. It's, for those of us who grew up in a certain style, it's just easier to stick with that style. It's easy for me to stand at the board and do the problems and then give out the homework at the end of the hour. But that students just have short attention spans nowadays. Holy cow, after 10 minutes, their eyes are glazed. So I do find that I need to interact with them and engage them. And a great way to do it is to have them work together, as you say.
As we try to implement the 8 math practices within our middle school, we found that the students don't know what they are. So one of the things that we've done is I found these kid-friendly posters about each one of the math practices, and I'm encouraging our teachers to spend 2 to 3 days a week looking at the math practice. So if today is critique the reasoning of others and construct viable arguments, when the students are presenting their work, I'm reminding them, what are you doing as a class? What are you as a responsibility as a class? So we talk about, we pull the poster off the interactive bulletin board, I put the poster up, and we'll say, all right, you're listening. You're comparing your thought process to their thought process. You're asking questions when you don't understand, and you're attempting to find flaws in their logic. So when we're working on the math practices, we're literally going through and saying, this is what the math practice means, and this is what your expectations are as a student. The classroom discussion has been very difficult for some of our teachers. They 2 years ago, I probably wasn't very good in questioning. So what we've done is we've provided question sticks that promote the thinking based on each one of the practices. So I found these posters from someone in Wichita, Kansas, and then I found these question sticks, and I think I got it from somebody else in like Maryland. And they developed these questions that are based on the specific math practices. And I've color-coded these sticks for everyone in our district that match.
They're like big sticks?
They're like, no, not so you can hit everybody.
just checking.
Just the popsicle ones. And so if it's perseverance, it's a brown poster and it's got brown, a little brown circle at the end. And those questions promote thinking about perseverance. And it's really helped our teachers ask questions because they may not have known what questions to ask. So in addition to those questions from Kansas or Wichita, there's also STEM questions that mathleadership.com and Pearson STEM questions have come from. We've started to add those questions. So when teachers are looking to ask questions they don't know, they can pull from the pile. And then to keep the kids engaged in questioning each other, I may say, I want you to stop your activity, and I put a stick down and I say, I'm going to come back in a couple of minutes. I want you and your partner to talk about this, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to expect a response. And I may do an individual conference with them, or I may hold the questions to the end so everyone can hear what their response is. And it's definitely increased the amount of confidence our kids have about using math language or being able to communicate about math, and it keeps everybody engaged. It's not the same two kids where everyone before the end of my activity will have had to have answered some type of question. And it's that forced questions for everybody.
Interesting. I just had one comment about, I'm all for questioning. I think it's an art and concrete ways to promote baby steps in questioning. All of that sounds great and it makes sense. In my experience, I've found that one of the hardest things to do as a teacher is after you've asked all those great questions, after you've looked at all those different approaches, for the last third of the, what did you say, the convergence part of the lesson, that's super hard. You have to know the math cold, you have to know what the key misconceptions were, and you have to knit it up, and usually you're running late. That's where I most likely see things break down. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get there, but I think that's an area where it's just super hard to do it well.
It makes me think of like lesson planning and how I think when I was being trained to be a teacher, it was here's what you're going to do in your lesson. And I think that's certainly important to map out, generally how you expect things to go. But you're dealing with human beings. So, and if you're really trying to pull from students what's going on rather than pushing to them, what's in our heads, then I think the other part has to be what's the real goal here, and it's not a to do, it's a to think, kind of, right? It's like here's the main idea, kind of this concept of no matter what happens, here's the thing I really want to make sure comes out. That's a crucial thing to have in one's head when you start off a lesson, I think, and so it's a very different experience that I still fumble all the time, but. To kind of be very open to whatever's going to happen and look for those little nuggets that kind of get to that. I took an improv comedy class, which is hilarious because I'm not funny. But I took an improv comedy class like a long time ago, and one of the key parts was about really listening to what's going on. It's the whole concept of yes and. Anyone ever done an improv comedy class here? Anyone? Yeah, I see one now. It was a yes and. It's a key concept. And so it's teaching, right? You hear yes. And so we're building off their knowledge. And I think to make it happen, there's got to be part of lesson planning, going back to purpose. What's the real purpose of this? What's the golden nugget idea of what's going on here? So I can listen for it.
And going back to what Robert said in terms of a lesson isn't in my 42-minute block. My students may not be able to answer the questions that I'm asking by the end of the class. And as teachers, and myself, I'm okay with it now. I used to not be okay with it, and now we have to learn that they may not be able to answer that essential question for 2 periods, and I need to be okay with that. And so, but they need to be reminded of what is that purpose, and I think that's why starting a class with, this is my essential question, this is what your goal is, and asking it throughout that activity, if it lasts 1 day or 2 days, is essential for them to finally get what you're trying to get them to do.
I think, however, sometimes giving away the objective sometimes takes away the learning, because sometimes the big idea that you want them to arrive at by themselves is within that objective. And so I think there's a time and place when it should be introduced at the beginning, but I think sometimes it's best at the end, after students have been able to have a chance to make meaning on their own and arrive at that conclusion.
Yeah, so I think the struggles come though when so whether you're broadcasting to the students what the purpose is or you're not, it's in your head as teacher. And one of the dangers, I guess, to show a non-example is I'll have a post-conference with a teacher who's saying, well, I wanted them to know about this and this and this and this. And I'm like, well, which one's the most important? Like you have to prioritize what's really important on that list. And so sometimes the ambitions can be too large, and so a teacher might say, well, I had to get through da-da-da, so I moved quicker on this. Like, well, you're thinking linearly, and we're math teachers, so for some reason, and it's not a linear process. That's the whole paradox, right? We're wired as mathematicians to be linear, and yet the teaching is not linear. So we have to say, wait a minute, what's the core idea? What's really important? And human beings we're going to work together to get there. It's a kind of a letting go in some ways, which I think is very difficult for a lot of, if I dare say, control freaks.
And I think going back to what Robert said in terms of not giving it away, I think we need to be very careful about what an essential question is. An essential question may be, how do I use algebra tiles to solve a two-step equation? But in my mind, my goal is I want to make sure they understand that how a zero pair can be represented, how do you perform with a zero pair, adding 3 is the same as, or subtracting 3 is the same as adding a negative 3. So I'm keeping those thoughts in my head, but my overall goal for them that I'm saying that they should be able to answer one day, 2 day, is my essential question is, how do I use algebra tiles to solve a two-step equation? So I think we're true about, we need to be careful about what questions we're asking them to respond to.
Research point. Math anxiety may start when children are quite young, but it can't come out of nowhere. What prompts it? Factors related to both students' math abilities at the start of elementary school and students' social environment in the classroom, at home, and in society in general likely play a role in the development of math anxiety. Mr. Wood, will begin with you. What can schools, teachers, and/or parents do to reduce math anxiety in students?
So math anxiety is a disease, and it spreads from parents to children. We often hear parents say, I'm not a math person, I'm not good at math, and for me it's just like, well, would that ever happen in language arts? I mean, how would we react as a parent saying, I'm not a reader? It shouldn't be okay to say that. I think saying that I'm not a math person, it's taking the assumption that some people can and can't learn math. And so we really have to get students to see that everyone can learn math. And so really we're talking about Standard for Math Practice 1, making sense of problems and persevering in solving them. To persevere, students have to know that your brain can grow. We used to think that the brain, started to solidify at a certain age, and I was afraid in college, oh my gosh, when I hit 30, I better learn everything now because I'm not going to learn anything after that. That's not how the brain works, right? We can grow our brain. So really getting students to understand that your brain can grow and helping them connect the work that you put in and what you had to do to persevere, that's really going to be longer lasting, and it's really going to help them feel better and less anxious about math. I also think anxiety comes from moving too fast. We really need to start thinking about moving at the speed of learning. So we have these pacing guides, we have the scope and sequence, and I feel like the pacing guide is really more promoting this acquisition of skills, not really the development of concepts. Sometimes some lessons are going to take longer with certain populations, and so we need to honor that learning time. We also need to be okay with productive struggle. Very often we are afraid that if a student has a misconception, it's going to solidify. Like, oh my gosh, let me rush in and make sure that you don't walk away with this misconception even overnight. It doesn't happen that way. We've had misconceptions that we've sorted out through conversations in our lives. I learned of so many things from my parents that were not true. And so as adults, I had to unlearn those things, and I unlearned them. So it's like we really have to honor it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to have a misconception. That being said, our society is not very mistake-friendly. When we give feedback, we're often focused on mistakes. We're not really giving feedback on the process and what people really did to make things happen. And so we really have to support people with praise and start to praise the process. Don't praise people because they're smart. When you praise people because they're smart, what you're saying is that when you don't understand something, it's because you're not smart. And that's a really hard pill for some students to swallow. I've had a lot of students go from 5th grade into my 6th grade classes who did really well. They were able to memorize things, but the second that they really had to apply what they were learning, they fell flat. They didn't have this idea of perseverance, and now they start to say things like, oh, I used to be good at math, but I no longer am. So it really is developing this idea of perseverance, really developing this positive growth mindset and getting them to see that you can grow your brain and to see mistakes as a gift. Now, the challenge of the teacher is to create this environment where mistakes are seen as this opportunity to learn. And sometimes that takes the teacher to admit, hey, I'm not always going to be right. I'm not always going to be perfect, but we're always working to get better.
I'd agree with that. The classroom needs to be a supportive, encouraging environment where people do feel free to experiment. And yet, sometimes it's not like that. How many of you have ever had a teacher who either said to you or somehow communicated to you, oh my gosh, you are so dumb. I can't believe you made that mistake. Have any of you had that experience? Oh, it's just terrible. It's devastating. And we certainly want to avoid situations like that. We want to avoid communicating that orally, or certainly somehow communicating that to the students, because it's so easy to forget what we were like before we learned these things, before we knew these things. So I'd agree with everything Robert said.
I would do the same in terms of creating that classroom culture of feeling safe in a classroom. If they're afraid to ask a question, they're not going to ask a question. How many of us at the end of the lecture said, are there any questions? And not a hand goes up, but you're pretty sure a third of your class has no clue what's going on. So some of the more practical things is within a classroom is, what are you doing in your class so that kids like coming there? What are you doing in your classroom that kids enjoy your 42 minutes with you? If you're within the restraints of I'm sitting in a row for 40 minutes and I don't like it, most likely they're going to have anxiety. One of the things that I like to do is I no longer ask who doesn't understand it, but I'll go to groups or small pairs or small groups and say, do you guys have any questions? Because they're more likely to ask questions if it's a smaller setting. They're not raising their hand, especially in middle school. So I totally agree with creating a culture that's safe, not praising them for doing nothing, but also allowing them to have some success. So figuring out something within your class that student who maybe doesn't understand a lot of what's going on and they need the additional support, figuring out what are you going to do so they can succeed, so they then have the notion of, well, maybe I can do it again.
Go ahead.
I couldn't agree more with everything that my colleagues just said, and very well articulated, I think, all those aspects. I find myself also thinking about some other aspects here, and one of them is about sort of not having all your cards face up on the table with your students, so starting with what we're learning. A real good way to create anxiety is to have a test that looks nothing like what you were learning in class. That just kills a kid, right? I had a conversation with a kid the other day who felt that way. And we had to start having a really good conversation, but the sad thing is she's a junior talking about how she started having these feelings in 3rd grade. So she's been living with this all that long. And it's heartbreaking, and that particular student was so driven to succeed, to ace the test, that the reason she was talking with me is because she was caught cheating. But we peeled back the onion to realize this really was about a math anxiety. And so there's so much that plays in. It is the society. It's the parents who are saying, well, I'm not good at math. It's that feeling in the classroom. But I think a practical thing that we can do also is to be really clear about these are the targets for the unit. And maybe a lesson doesn't reveal it right away. I think there's, you don't want to reveal the magic in the very beginning all the time. But as far as the unit, this is what it's about. Here's what you're supposed to know. And to have students in the driver's seat when it comes to assessment. So we have to train, and this is part of that academic character piece, I think it fits in with the grit and all that, of training them to have quality self-perception, right? An accurate self-assessment. So if these are the things I'm supposed to know, if I'm supposed to be able to graph a line. I'm supposed to be able to interpret a graph and explain how this connects to reality. I'm like, well, can I? Am I able to do that? Now, and do I know that because I know that, or because someone just told me, well, you have an 89%, that's how well you know it, so I'm telling you that. Like, where's the ownership? And so being clear about what the targets are, getting students in the driver's seat to be able to be reflecting on that and grading themselves, I think that's key. And training them on, so that by the time they get to the test or an assessment, it's not new. It's not the first time they've taken that test. Furthermore, to have reassessments available to emphasize that this class is about learning. The most liberating thing I did last year in my algebra class was I got rid of points entirely. You didn't get points for anything. And I took away the game. I said, this is about learning. So did you learn these things? Prove it. Well, if you did, tell me what your grade should be and make an argument. And we did it based on a rubric, so it wasn't totally fluffy, but they got to make an argument. Here's my grade based upon some generally, some descriptions of what an A is and a B is, da-da-da. That was all. And, oh, you didn't learn it yet? Keyword yet? Well, so what are you going to do to learn it? And so it removed the high stakes feeling, and they could come and assess it. On another test, I would have a version 2, or stop by at the end of school and explain it to me. I'm sure that with a 3-minute conversation, we'll be able to know whether you know it or not. And kids would admit to me, I don't know it yet. Okay. And then later, I could see you next week. So you know it now? Biggest smile you ever seen. Yeah. And now they know it. And so that anxiety is gone because they're led into the process and they're really owning it. There's all those cards are face up. I think that's important.
Really interesting thoughts. Other thing I was thinking about is if teachers see math as just arithmetic, there's a lot of arithmetic anxiety because arithmetic is a narrow part of mathematics. And if there's a broader view, if logic, concepts, even though those are actually a lot more accessible than crazy algorithms. And I think a lot of anxiety is produced because of a narrow view of mathematics. The second thing, which seems a little counterintuitive, is that I think if more teachers admitted that I'm just going to focus on K-8 mathematics. It's complex. There are things, try explaining the difference between a fraction and a ratio. Which one is a number and which gives rise to the other? Complicated concepts. So you could say, oh great, that makes things accessible. Now people are really going to be freaking out. No, admitting as a teacher, holy cow, I've never really thought about that interpretation of division in this word problem. Whoa, let me see if I can do this. You're communicating, it's a collective thing, like, yeah, this is actually complex, and it's going to be thoughtful, but we're going to be thoughtful together, can be disarming. So I think it's the personality of the teacher and a recognition that even 4th grade mathematics is real complicated stuff. It's accessible, but it's still something we're going to have to think about, and then just not defining math as arithmetic. There are 2 ways.
Thank you.
So I wanted to just comment on a couple of things. David brought up a really good point about assessment, and I caution teachers to assess when the learning is happening. If you want learning to continue, don't grade things just yet, because a couple of things will happen. If a student gets a good grade, they think, wow, I got a good grade, I know this, I don't need to pay attention anymore. And the student who didn't get a good grade is just going to say, wow, I can't do this. So if you want the learning to continue, hold back on the grading. Also, I want to just build on a little bit what Kirk said. We have to remember that teachers often teach the way that they were taught. So the teachers that we're working with, they didn't experience Common Core. They didn't experience these standards for mathematical practice. So in our professional development, we really need to see them as learners and to take the same considerations that we're having for our own students with teachers, teaching them how to persevere, to develop these growth mindsets. You bring up K-8 education, and I think it's a sad thing to know that there are teachers who don't teach math or teach very little of it because they have anxiety about it as well. So all the things that we're saying about students and developing, this perseverance and this growth mindset, all of these things apply to teachers, and so we really need to start thinking about adult education and capitalizing on the research regarding adult education.
Thank you. Our 4th research point: 3 challenges that must be addressed by schools. Changing the beliefs of educators who do not believe in the ability of all students to learn challenging material. overcoming political interests and that supports the status quo, for example, parents of high-achieving students. Resolving technical challenges around the difficulty of supporting students of widely varying levels of past performance. Dr. Bialik, we'll start with you. Can you please talk with us about K-12 mathematics achievement as an equity issue in the era of the Common Core state standards? And obviously you can use your experience as a higher ed professor in response to this question as well.
Sure, absolutely. If you were my class, I would have you stretch right now, because it's after lunch. I can see it in your faces that you're just dying out there. So I think we should stretch.
Brain break?
Thank you. If you really want to have fun, you can do this for a brain break. If you guys have done this, kind of gauge your. Have you done that? Yeah, I see a lot of nods. So if you haven't done it, you got to try it, right? It's one circle this way, the other circle the other way.
The other way. Yep.
Good, I just.
Pulling all the stops out, that was good.
No, not same way. Not I see saying you're doing this.
And they got to cap
Yeah, the
it
same
at
way
the
is
same
too
time, right?
Okay,
Thank you.
with Common Core state standards, if we...
This is my research at work. I like this.
Yeah, I think
We're not
it
classroom
was a
management.
bad idea to stretch. I think I've lost my class. With Common Core state standards, if we really want to catch up to or keep pace with the rest of the world, boy, there's a lot of mathematics these kids need to know and master. And as this points out, the challenge is that some districts are better resourced, better equipped to handle that. The question is, so I see how do you resolve the technical challenges around the difficulty of instructing and supporting students of widely varying levels of past performance? Fortunately, we've seen some answers even today about the use of technology. For example, my friend at church invented the flipped classroom. And so whenever I see him, I feel obligated to flip my classroom, because otherwise it's embarrassing. You know, it's I have this guy, this guru who invented the flipped classroom, and I've never even bothered to do it. This semester, I tried it for the first time, and I find it's amazing that students who are kind of slow can still keep up with the class. Students who are pretty quick, they can move ahead, and they can do their other homework in class, for example. So it's neat to see that there are these technological advances that we couldn't take advantage of in previous years because of YouTube and these other sites that we've seen. So I don't look at technology as a panacea, but I think of it as a way that we can achieve Common Core state standards. Now, of course, the inevitable issue is, well, yeah, that's easy if you're connected to the internet. Not everybody's connected to the internet. And yet, as my friend told me, where there's a will, there's a way. Some of his students in his chemistry class in Colorado didn't have access to the internet, so he just put things on DVD. There are ways that we can overcome technical challenges and still use technology to help our students keep pace with the rest of America and the rest of the world.
Jillian, do you have anything to add to this question?
I used to work in a district that my kids went to David's high school, and it took me about 2 years to adjust now that I'm teaching in Hinsdale, which is pretty affluent, and I'm noticing that I'm so much better off in terms of the resources. And so I feel like the Common Core has really put teachers that don't have resources, materials alone. You know, I'm fortunate enough to be in a district that can pilot materials that actually are Common Core, rather than using a textbook from 2000 or 19-something. So I really think that the Common Core has created this divide. I understand the goal was to eliminate the gap, but I do see that it's creating more of a gap because of the lack of resources that some of these districts have. And you'd like to see that it be narrowed, but I am concerned about that. And how many of you guys are taking the park on paper? And how many of you guys are taking it on computer? And so I'm interested to see what it's going to happen if I can click on a problem and I can drag and drop the discrepancy between the two. And you know, with those districts that have those the computer accessibility versus those that are not, it'll be interesting to see if there's a discrepancy between those scores.
David?
Yeah, So I guess I want to think about a little bit of a broader picture too, and it's this is something we could talk about for a long time, but I think that Common Core, if we sort of step back, we see it as a progression in decades, hundreds of years even, of work to carry out social justice. And I think about what the work that we do and why we come into teaching. There are a lot of ways we can affect change in our society, and many people choose to do it through litigation, through legislation, as doctors, as social workers, and there's all kinds of ways that we can improve the lives of people in our society. No profession, in my opinion, can do any of that as much as we can as teachers. It is us who spends the majority of time with people during their developmental time. And so I think about us as a huge lever for making change. And so at face value, look at just Common Core itself, despite a lot of serious concerns with it, like resources, the half full glass part of it says it is taking away birthright as what you get to know and learn in school. It's saying that whether you're born in Arkansas or Illinois or wherever, these are the things, well, for most of the states at least, these are the things that we want you to know. And while these standards aren't perfect, by and large, I think we accept them as high quality. Certainly better than what we've had, or at least embracing some of the best stuff we've seen in, whether it be like New York or California. And so, I like that. I like that it creates an excellence, a bar of excellence for everybody. But that bar of excellence is about giving equal standards for everyone. It's a high bar. And equity isn't all about equality. We have to, I think, this is the structural conversation. I think that if we look at a broader scope, and I apologize because it's going to be a longer discussion, but in its essence, I think that we also, if we're talking about equity, need to not just look at structures, but take hard looks in the mirror as to who we are. And going back to conversations we had about student-centered, how do we see our kids? I'm so embarrassed, and I can't believe I say this publicly, but when I started teaching, I didn't really click that those are, this is so embarrassing to say, I didn't really click that those are like people's kids. Somewhere along the line, I felt it. I was like, that's a son or a daughter, right? And it changed the way that I began to think, and I began to open up and truly hear, and as a white man, that's its own journey of saying, okay, so I'm a part of this system that's very white, and yeah, we have a lot of money, but how does it feel to be a black, a brown, Asian, to be a student that's different than me who's running this school? And that's changed how I think, and it's a lifelong journey. So I think that I'm very thankful for Common Core. I think it's a huge step. It's a structural step that's imperfect, but a progress. I don't want to miss out on the human factor, that to pursue equity isn't just about having a bar of excellence. It's also about doing the real work of what we could call cultural competence, and each one of us doing our own journey of what that looks like so we can truly, truly carry out the core values of all the kids in our classroom.
So I'm glad that David said, equity does not mean equal. Equity means that everyone is getting what they need. And everyone deserves opportunities to engage in mathematics as meaning makers, as doers and thinkers of mathematics. So we really have to ask ourselves, who gets to participate in math classes and how? Math is one of those subjects that we can accelerate in. We can move very quickly. But one thing that's slowing me down is thinking, okay, so you understand the content, but what about these standards for mathematical practice? How good are you at communicating your thinking to others? Because if you can't, what use are you to society? We really want to understand your point of view, what you're thinking. So we really have to take time to give students opportunities to deepen their understanding, develop these standards for mathematical practice. One teacher that I support has a fully integrated push-in model where she partners with her special ed teacher, and all of the diverse learners are dispersed in these heterogeneous groups. And when I interviewed them and asked, why does this model work for you? And he said, well, a couple of things. My diverse learners are learning a lot of practical skills like, how to be ready for class, how to, what are the social norms that we're governed by, and how to operate. And I asked, well, what benefit do the more proficient students have? And he said, well, one advantage that they have is that they get to understand how people misunderstand mathematics and misconceptions that are there. And also, while they are explaining ideas to the less proficient students, they're cementing their own understandings. They're working on their precision. They're trying to find multiple ways to get someone else to understand what it is that they're thinking. So, putting kids in these tracks where you get to go fast and you get to stay behind because you don't have these foundational skills, I think is a detriment to everyone. We all have something to learn from each other. And so, I don't have all the answers because, it's like, well, how does this, how do we get, is everyone going to be on the track to, taking that calculus AP exam their senior year? I don't know how it's going to work, but I think that it's a missed opportunity if we continue to separate and track kids completely without any chance of you ever getting onto a different track. So I guess to sum it up, all students should be provided ways to access mathematics. That's what we're really talking about. So access within lessons and just access in general. And all students should have a voice in the mathematics classroom.
I don't think, if we focus on, let's say, the lowest performing schools, which are in some of the poorest neighborhoods with no jobs, it doesn't really matter what the Common Core is. I mean, honestly, let's just be honest. If there's some places where, and I've worked in those places, where you do your best as a school to change a culture, but it's way more. It's jobs. It's making concrete connections to actually leveraging myself through school. So, I mean, if we're talking about those equity issues, I don't think that's the whole point. Those are going to be with us, sadly, for a long time. And I don't think the Common Core, I mean, we can chip away at things, and there'll be examples here and there, but when you're in some of the most challenged neighborhoods, I mean, your heart breaks whether you're teaching the Common Core standards or traditional math for all of those kids. So I want to end on a high note. No. But that said, I also feel like, and having worked in some of those schools and seeing the little video of Horace Mann going off to Prussia for his honeymoon, the culture in many schools where I've worked and visited in urban schools settings is more factory-like, and it is more about order and maintaining order, and there are people who, for good reason, say that's sort of a necessary first step. You have to have order, but I also feel like it's harder to instill this kind of change in some of those environments where the kids, rightfully so, are in some cases prefer something that's cleaner and packaged and organized, and I can just be on my way and go home and take care of my two siblings after school rather than be pushed to think and probe. So I think we need to be really careful about cultural, structural things that are deep. I mean, we did a study in South Chicago and in 20 schools all around Midway Airport. Amazing stuff happening there, and yet really challenging neighborhoods. And I want Common Core. I want it all. I want energetic people that are doing their best, and I think that's a necessary first step. But it would also be great if, when I graduated from that high school, I could do some computer programming in my neighborhood because there was actually a job where I'm applying my programming skills. That's I think, the real equity stuff, which clearly I don't have answers to that. I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. Are there any final thoughts from the panel on our discussions today that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, on this topic, I first of all want to just think that this question was part of it. I think it's a huge one. It's what some people term a wicked problem. There's just so much to it, and in many ways insolvable. But yet, I think it is solvable in pockets. And I want to build a little bit on Robert was talking about tracking and access to mathematics. In our district, we got rid of tracking for mathematics, for algebra, a few years back, and so we ended up creating these classrooms where we got rid of those lowest levels, and every kid is taking a college-level algebra class at least. And what we do is then provide different types of supports for students so that they can pull it off. And the net result has been extremely positive. We've seen evidence that we are narrowing a minority student achievement gap in our district. And it's still early, but this can work. And it is incredibly complex, and we are so much in the beginning of, I think, a long journey. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of detracking, providing the supports, and there's a resource issue there, but it's also a PD issue. It's also a cultural, and, what does it mean to support? And this access to mathematics too, just to highlight, some months ago, if any of you have gone to an Ed Trust conference, has anyone been to Ed Trust? I see a couple nods. I'm wowed by them. The whole basis of Ed Trust is they go to schools that have shown evidence of achieving, they go to like 90 schools basically, and so schools where they have high poverty rates, high percentage of students of color, and extremely high achievement, up where some of them are like 98% of them are meeting and exceeds. And so we start with the best of the best in this country and say, what are you doing? And so these are great conferences. And one of the principals was talking, and he relayed a story. He said, the reason that we did this is because our work is truly a matter of life and death. When I know that the people in my state are predicting the number of jail cells using my 4th grade reading scores, that's why I do what I do. The same can be true, as we said, of mathematics. Mathematics carries the same weight, if I might dare say more, in some ways than reading. When we know that students who just take Algebra 2 are almost guaranteed to get accepted into college, and for those who don't, they got a 50-50 chance of getting accepted. They're 4 times more likely to get accepted into a higher, more selective school. And when it comes to jobs, just by taking Algebra 2, we see that you're going to get paid more to start, and you're going to get paid more each year after that. Your increases are more. So the impacts are very real, and that's just Algebra 2. That's not even discussing like how well a student truly learns this communication and the perseverance pieces. Those, again, I have to repeat this, like it's not just about math. When you learn those things, the same people doing this research are showing that people stay married more. I mean, it's that widespread. If we talk about equity, we can make those kind of impacts into success. So I just can't emphasize enough, I think, that this lends it for us to take, and sorry to go on about it, but I want to build on the tracking and the access. I think it's incredibly important.
And isn't that why we're all here? I mean, you're good in mathematics. There are a lot of things you can do that would make you a lot more money than what you're doing. But what you're doing really can change lives. I'm listening to the biography of Steve Jobs, and he talks about, he talked to the author about his 4th grade teacher. Now, how his 4th grade teacher had such an impact on him. She was like a savior to him in the way she dealt with him, because he was kind of a problem child. He was very smart. He was a problem child. But she worked with him. She saw that spark in him, and rather than crush that spark, she really worked with him. And what she did had an impact not just on him, but on the world.
Very good. Thank you. Well, I would like to thank each of our panelists for our responses, our engagement, sharing your knowledge, your expertise, bringing our theory into practice for our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.